So welcome everyone. This is Accessing Farmland Together, intended to provide you some tips and tricks for navigating through our recently released tool on group farmland access, and we'll make sure to send that out to you in the chat and in follow-up materials. It's sponsored by the Beginning Farmer and Land Access cohort of Cultivemos, which is part of the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network. And we're funded by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network project. My name is Rachel Bryce, and I am the program coordinator with Land for Good. I'm speaking with you from the lands of the Abenaki. For me, something that is important about land is to acknowledge its history and its present, because I believe that land is something to be honored and treasured rather than exploited. And I believe that my colleagues at Land for Good and at Cultivemos share those values. We have a real awareness of the lived history of the indigenous peoples and nations in the context of a very long and ongoing era of colonialism. And so I want to just take a minute to acknowledge and honor those who continue to steward this land as they have done since time immemorial. If this map is something that's interesting to you, I would encourage you to check it out at nativeland.ca, and I've linked that in the chat. You can do a direct search for the place where you are if you haven't had the chance to explore that previously. In just a second, I'd like to let one of our interpreters speak to this slide, and then I'll go over it again in English. And if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Oh, okay. Sorry for the glitch. 1 second.
Buenas tardes.
Okay, try again.
Buenas tardes, ¿me pueden escuchar? Bien, soy la intérprete Margarita y está Brandon también. Y para tener acceso a la interpretación, por favor, por computadora, hay que buscar un globito terráqueo y presionarlo y elegir el idioma español. O si tiene celular, tiene que buscar los 3 puntitos y elegir interpretación de idiomas. Y después luego tiene que presionar donde dice español. Y también hay un chateo, que usted puede mandar mensajes por texto. Abajo se ve donde dice chat. Estamos disponibles para traducir todo. Bienvenidos. Gracias.
Thank you. Let me turn that back on. And to review again in English, if you're interested in accessing the interpretation services, there are 2 channels, both English and Spanish, which you can access through this icon, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you have any issues, please reach out in chat. And then if you are in the Spanish channel and the English is disorienting, you can mute that original audio. And then in addition to live interpretation for this webinar, we're currently working on a Spanish translation of our Accessing Land Together guide, which we'll make sure to send out to all of the participants and make public on our websites as soon as it's available. So for today's agenda, we'll briefly hear from both Mike Gia and Kathy Roof, who are with Land for Good. And then there'll be time after that presentation of content for any of you who have questions to ask them. And then we'll have some time to hear from farmers with lived experience in group land access from 3 different farmers in farms in the region, and you'll have time to answer questions of those folks as well. And so with that, I'd just like to turn it over to Kathy.
Great. Thank you. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So slide, please. Okay, so first we're going to talk about what we mean by group farmland access. So a lot of times people use the term collective farming, collaborative farming. There are all kinds of ways to farm together. Farmers can share equipment, inputs, marketing, or labor. Farmers can also share land. And none of these are new concepts. Farmers have been coexisting on land and farming cooperatively for probably eons. Next slide. In the decision tool or guide that Land for Good put together, we tried to create a construct that would make it a little bit more straightforward to help people think about and plan for what it is that group farmland access means. And so for us, it means 2 or more farmers using a specific property for commercial farming. The group might also consist of farmers and non-farmers, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. And so by contrast, farmers, let's say you know a landowner who owns 100 acres, and there are 4 farmers each renting 25 acres and doing their own thing and have separate rental agreements with that landowner. They don't have any sort of shared vision. They're not cooperating in any other way. There's nothing that ties them together. That would not be considered group farming, although they are on a single property. Next slide. So what are the defining features? As I said, it is farmers accessing a piece of land together, but it could be more than one parcel. There is some spirit of cooperation, however formalized. There's purposeful interaction regarding how the land is used and managed among the farmer users, and some type of legal arrangement. Again, more or less formal, and we'll get into that as we go along today. Next slide. Why? I think any of you who are on the webinar today probably have good answers of your own for this. Land is expensive, hard to find, and especially for historically disadvantaged groups that currently continue to face discrimination in finding land on their own. And in addition, farming can be isolating. A group endeavor can spread risk, thereby reducing it for any individual person. But as Mike will tell you, that's not always and necessarily the case. There's definitely a sense of community if it's done right, and sharing land can lead to or interact with other ways of sharing and learning. Next slide. So farmers, a lot of times we are approached by farmers who have strong ideas and visions and values around sharing land. Concept is appealing. Reality can be extremely satisfying. It also does involve things like money, control, decision-making, accountability. It's not necessarily an easy picture. So farmers, you need to ask yourselves, why are you interested in group land access? That's the very fundamental question. And then, what is your group? Who's in your group? How is the group defined? What do you hope to achieve as a group together? And what might be some of those challenges? And we're going to definitely get into that today. Next. So as I'm sort of emphasizing, group land access can be amazingly rewarding and also complicated. There are 3 ways to think about the relationships in group farmland access. One is interpersonal, which is all the social dynamics, communications, and that can involve cultural specifics and cultural diversity, language, and different values, as well as shared values. Certainly, the legal arrangements are essential regarding how rights and responsibilities are allocated. Often, these are written down. I think best practice would suggest that they be written down, but that's not always the case. And then the management relationships are sort of the glue between the social and the legal. And these may be actually the most essential, is about how the group is actually managed and governed. And we'll get into that more as well. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about some basic things that go into the thinking process around group land access. Again, what are the values and purposes? Why do you want to do this? And second, with whom? Who are the individuals or entities? Is there an LLC that is one of the farms that wants to be involved? Are they all separate farms? Are they individuals? Are they non-farmers? What land or property are you talking about or thinking about? And are there other assets as well? could be equipment, could be buildings, other infrastructure on the property. And then, as I mentioned, what are the legal structures and arrangements that articulate the rights and responsibilities and commitments? And very important, Mike will get into this a little bit more, how are people to join and how can people exit equitably? And that means what's fair and also with whatever equity they have involved, if that happens to be the model. What documents are needed and how are they executed? Where do you get the help to do those correctly? And then again, what is the management structure? Who is responsible? I worked with a group in Rhode Island that was renting land separately, and they very much wanted to form a co-op so that they could hold that land together. And we worked and worked and worked with them. And the reason that it fell apart was that nobody was willing to step up and be the manager. Nobody was willing to take more responsibility or the amount of responsibility that was needed to actually pull together the details and keep the thing going. Next slide. So more basics. What types of entities? Are you all sole proprietors? Are you, has your farm formed a different entity? And then what type of tenure? Those of you who follow Land for Good know that we talk about the basic fork in the road. You can either own the land or not own the land. So in our guide, we've made that important distinction and we've color coded it so that orange is for ownership and teal blue is for tenancy. If you are not planning to own the land as a group, then you will be tenants in one form or another. So you need to understand what types of landlords are out there and the types of rental arrangements, whether it's a short or longer term lease, whether it's a ground lease in which you rent the land and own the infrastructure or some of the infrastructure, or whether it's a license. And there are several examples of that. A license confers different kinds of rights to both parties than a lease does. Next slide. I don't expect that you're able to read this. This is a sort of a decision chart from our Farm Access Decision Guide, Farm Access Methods. The basic concept here, again, is between ownership and non-ownership. You can see on the left, there are several ways to implement ownership tenure. In the middle, it says ownership in the future. That means the eventual ownership of a specific piece of property, not that you're going to rent land now and maybe 10 years from now you might want to buy something. This is how you get onto a piece of land, own it, rent it, and then be able to own it in the future. Next slide. The group land access tool has several worksheets that help farmers walk through the kinds of thinking that we encourage when considering farmland access. First of all, is group farmland access right for you? What group type are you, which we're going to get into? And then this tenure fork in the road, do you want to or can you own or rent? What method can work for you? And we'll look at the decision tree around the 10 potential methods. And what do you need to consider, which is what Mike will get into. Next slide. I want to emphasize that although we have made these constructs to help people think through group farmland access, there are all kinds of variations on these structures that are possible. So don't feel bound by the sort of categories that we've put out here. That said, I'm going to walk us through the 4 categories that we have articulated. The first one, called one farm group, means there's a single farm with multiple farmers within that one farm. It's one farm entity. It files taxes as a single farm. It does its finances as a single farm. And the people in it may have different enterprises, but it's one farm. The intentional group is separate farm businesses who intentionally come together to commit to owning or renting a property together. So you might be 3 farmers, each one might be a sole proprietor, the other one might be an LLC, and the third one might be an entity as well. And you come together saying, we want to have our separate businesses, but we want to share land. The third category is a situational group, and these are separate farm businesses who independently come to a property to rent that property. It's not going to happen that you sort of independently show up and buy land together. So this is only a rental model. And it's often shows up in like a community farm or an incubator where various tenants are renting and they're collaborating in various ways, including how they manage and use the land. The fourth category is a mix, where there can be farmers and non-farmers who own or rent a property together. Sometimes it's an intentional community where there are just residents who own some of the homes, and then there's land as well that's rented. Or it could be some farmers own the land and rent some of their land to other farmers. So that's a mixed tenure. So it could be mixed categories of people or mixed tenure. Next slide. So this is the flow chart. Again, you're not going to be quizzed on this. This is the way to think through what it is that you're interested in exploring. So you'll see up at the top, after you've determined that this is a model that you're interested in pursuing, the 4 choices of groups. And just to walk through it as an example, Rachel, are you able to have that cursor up again? That was helpful the last time. There you are. So let's say you decide that you're an intentional group. There's 3 or 4 of you that each have your own farm business. Then you decide that you're going to rent, not own. So you remember that that teal color is rent. You follow the arrows down to the 2 possibilities of in this method. One is that you each have separate leases from a landowner. The other is that you can I have to get that out of the way, just a second. There we go. You can, as separate entities, form a real estate holding entity and purchase, and rent that land together. Sometimes landowners are a little reluctant to have multiple tenants. So sometimes it makes sense to have one tenant and then each farm business is a separate subtenant. So you can see that there's 10 methods. Some of them describe ownership and some of them describe tenancy under each one of those group models. Okay, next slide. So I pretty much will just go through this really quickly. Again, if you're one farm, separate individuals farming as one farm entity, you could theoretically buy or rent land together as individuals, but that's typically not recommended. If you want to buy land together, it's best practice to form a real estate entity that purchases and holds the land and then rents to a rents to a farm business. If you are a one farm group and you want to rent, then that single farm entity rents from a landlord. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, intentional is separate farm businesses, which can form a real estate entity that owns the land and then leases portions to the individual farm businesses. Alternatively, as we walk through in that flow chart, each farm business can have a separate lease with a landlord, but they will have something in common so that they're not just renting, as I described earlier. They may be under an incubator or a community farm where there are other values and operating mechanics that hold them together, or they can form a single entity to rent from a landlord. Next slide. The situational one is where you show up and you are renting land with others under a common umbrella. You might have a lease directly with a landlord, or there's an organization that is the master tenant. Nuestras Raíces, that Maria will speak to us about, is an example of that. New Entry Sustainable Farming Project is another. Next slide. And then this mixed group is where some farmers own the land and rent it to some other farmer. So there's ownership and tenancy on a single property. And then, as I mentioned, another one where farmers and non-farmers can own land together or rent land together. Next slide. I think that's you, Mike. So I'm passing it over to Mike, who's going to get into a lot of the more nitty-gritty on some of the considerations.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Yin. I'm the Vermont field agent for Land for Good. Now I'm going to spend about 20 minutes or so now talking about some of these key considerations, some of which I think will be obvious to many of you who've been giving this some thought, and others are ones that I commonly see overlooked in these discussions. The first section I want to go over is around legal considerations and legal structure. When we get contacted by people who are looking to farmland together, as Kathy said, some people will talk about collective farming or collaborative farming, or they'll say cooperative farming, and particularly when they emphasize or some way include the word cooperative or collective, I press them on trying to understand whether they really mean a cooperative in the legal sense. Many people are not aware that there are different types of legal entities out there, and that what those look like, and what that a cooperative is actually a specific type of legal entity that has specific legal requirements under the laws of the given states, and as well as different tax implications. And what I've listed here in the first bullet on the slide is a host of the different legal entities that you could use in accessing land, particularly owning, but also in some lease situations. I've seen about all of these implemented here in the Northeast, except the ASOP. So I think there's one in progress here and coming together. And all of these different structures have, as I said, different legal and tax considerations. And getting back to what Kathy was saying at the very beginning, there is a real need for the group to understand what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, what are the goals for the group. And that's really going to define what legal structure is going to be the most appropriate. In some cases, a cooperative may be the best structure. In other cases, a community land trust, which is often structured as a nonprofit or 501c3, or an LLC will be maybe the best structure. And so going through that process that Kathy was describing at the beginning to figure out really what you're trying to do is the most important thing, rather than getting hung up on a specific legal structure from the beginning. Because if you go to an attorney and you ask for a specific legal structure, they might tend to just keep going down that pathway. And really, when you go to an attorney for advice on setting up the structure, you should be bringing to the table what you're trying to accomplish, what you're thinking, how you think some of these other issues that we're going to talk about are going to come into play. And the attorney may point you in a different direction in terms of the structure. So it's really critical to get professional legal advice on this, but coming to the table prepared to help that legal professional do the best possible job by really understanding what you're trying to do. It's also important to think about the tax implications of these different structures. And this is one I think often gets overlooked. People are not muted. If you could please mute. So getting tax advice is really important on this, because you may find that there are tax implications to a particular structure that may make you decide to go in a different direction. So you may have multiple structures, as we've already been alluding to. You may have multiple structures for different purposes and different legal documents. So for instance, you may form a limited liability company or LLC that holds the land. And then you have a ground lease between farms or parties that own the individual infrastructure, barns or houses, and they have title to those separately. So there's going to be deeded titles to those and a ground lease that connects those. And then there may be separate agricultural leases. And so these things can take time and significant funds sometimes to get all the legal documents in place. When people come together and everybody's excited and positive and everything, we want to, encourage people to, move forward. But we also want people to be realistic about the things that can happen along the way, and that, we're not all going to live forever. People are going to retire. Sometimes, unfortunately, people get divorced. People will die prematurely. Things will come up. And so when you put these legal agreements together, you need to be thinking about what we call the 5 Ds. What's going to happen in the case of death, divorce, disaster, disagreement, or disability of a member, and how's that going to influence their position and their equity within whatever entities that you're putting together. And that goes along with thinking about how do people enter and exit. You may have people that are going to leave leave the organization for various reasons. You may have divorces, and you may have disagreements. You may have people that want to retire, people who want to move for family reasons. And then you may want to be bringing in other people. What is going to be the process of deciding how do people enter the business, and what might they have to contribute to enter the business? When someone leaves, what equity can they take with them? Or if they pass on, what are their heirs eligible to? Are they eligible to the full equity of that member, or are they eligible to automatically become a member, or is there still a process of approving that person? What happens when someone wants to retire and bring in a successor to the business, particularly if it's someone who's not already a part of the organization and not a part of the family? What is going to be the process to allow for that to happen, that transition to happen to the next generation? Because we know if we want these things to be sustainable long term, that we don't all live forever, we don't all work forever. So there needs to be thoughts at the very beginning for that kind of process. And then just even basics, who's going to have their names on the documents? Who's going to be responsible for different aspects of the business or of management? As Kathy was saying, talking about managing these entities takes some work. How are decisions going to be made? By whom? Are they going to be what decisions are going to be made by the group as a whole? And what does that process look like? And what decisions can be made by individuals, especially if there's going to be individual businesses there? What decisions can people make on their own about their particular part of the land that they're working, that they're managing, versus things that they may have to go to the group to get permission for before they can actually do things. And then how do businesses interact? And that can be positive in terms of collaborating together on different things, maybe even sharing particular specific acres and not just having individual plots within the land. And then, buffers and other things may come up where people have to think more about how do we manage around each other? How do we work together on shared infrastructure so we're not stepping on each other's toes? Or are there communal resources that people are using together? So for instance, a couple of parties that I've worked with that I'm familiar with have shared management of the woodlot on the property. In one case, they have a shared, there's individuals that do the farming on the property. There is a shared woodlot with a shared sugar bush, and that is a shared business between the group. In another case, the woodlot is just for timber management, but that timber income comes back to everyone that's a member of this. Next slide, please. So a question that really needs to be looked into at the very beginning and as you go along is, what level of security do the agreements provide? It's easy to take for granted, particularly if you walk into a group situation that's been established for a while, that there's good, solid legal agreements that people have thought through and that it provides the optimal security for everyone. And that's not always the case. We have definitely seen examples of where that's not the case. And so it's important to not take that for granted. And it's important for everyone to understand what they're signing on to legally as they get involved. And so that's why it's important for individuals to consult their own legal counsel. This can be hard for people to stomach because of the cost of lawyers, though in some cases there may be opportunities to work with different organizations that might provide lower cost legal aid. But you want to make sure that the lawyers involved understand the type of arrangement that you're getting into. We at Land for Good do a lot of work on intergenerational farm transfers, a lot of which are family, but sometimes involve non-family members. And even in the family member cases, we encourage, and a lot of times their own attorneys will encourage there to be multiple attorneys involved, because there's otherwise a conflict of interest. Who is that attorney representing? And you as an individual or as a family want to make sure that your own personal interests are protected. It's not always just about the expense and about that level of concern, but sometimes I've seen where bringing multiple attorneys into the picture can sometimes they can see things that the first attorney didn't see. There might be creative ideas that can come in there. And sometimes I've seen better legal arrangements come out that benefit everybody in the group, because there was another person in there that could take a fresh look at things and create new ideas. Legal liability is something to consider right from the beginning. We tend to emphasize a lot these days about things like LLCs and such as far as providing legal protection, but really those are like the last line of defense. You're going to want to think about how do we agree to how do we work together on making sure that safety is number one, whether it's food safety or safety on the farm, so that there is really a lower liability risk. And how do we make sure that we have some standards in our group about that? And then the second line of defense is liability insurance. And so every farm entity, as well as the real estate holding entity, need to have insurance. And the farmers need to be naming the real estate entity or the landlord, if it's a private landlord separate from the group, as additional insured on their liability insurance. And so if you're going to be owning the land together, you have to be thinking about who's going to be responsible for insurance, making sure the insurance is appropriate and renewed, and making sure that all of the other parties with their own businesses are doing exactly what I just said as far as getting insurance and naming the property owner as additional insured on that insurance. Stewardship should be a consideration early on. You may talk together, you may know each other for a long time before you get involved. You may think that everyone has the same stewardship standards, thinking about how do we take care of the land, the resources, and what does that mean, and think that everybody might think that means the same thing, and it may not. And so putting that in writing, what are the stewardship standards that we adhere to in this organization for taking care of the land and natural resources? And that can be incorporated into leases or the operating agreement for the real estate holding entity, or it could be a combination of those two. Certifications, some people may want or need to be certified organic. Does that mean the entire parcel has to be organic? That's something that has to be discussed amongst the group. If some people are going to certify it and some are not, there may be a need for buffers. How does that influence the land use on the property? So that should be discussed. Is subleasing allowed? And that could either pertain to, as Kathy was describing, situations where there's a lease and then there is a lease with a private landowner or maybe a city or town. And then there is a master lease with a group of other farms who are then subleasing. But you need to make sure first that the landlord, of course, is going to even allow for subleasing, and that master lease allows for subleasing. If you own the real estate as a group, then you have to think about, would subleasing be allowed if, say, somebody wants to help another farmer get started, sublease part of their parcel, or maybe they need to take a break from farming, but they're not ready to give up their particular part of the land and they want to sublease to another farmer. Maybe it's an injury that requires them to step out for a while, and so they maybe need to sublease to someone. They're helping a successor get started as they're going forward. If there's going to be a sublease allowed, is there a process that the group wants to establish so that someone can get approval of tenants that you might sublease to? Better to think about these things before they become an issue, because when they become an issue and people are trying to work out these arrangements, there can be a lot of stress. You know, we want to, if group land holding is a way of reducing stress, you have to look at things that can come up that can actually increase stress when you have to go to approval for other people in the group for things that you might have not had to do if you were going to if you already had the property just on your own. And the next one on the permission to construct infrastructure, you know, any one of these items, we could spend whole webinars on themselves. And some of them we might do that down the road. This one in particular is one that we could spend a lot of time on. And when we work with people on lease situations, infrastructure can be a big part of the lease. And if you're owning land together, thinking through the infrastructure, this aspect of infrastructure can be even more complicated in terms of people's different views of aesthetics, people's idea of how much land should be covered by barns, infrastructures, houses, and so forth. you know, if there's going to need to be an approval process within the group, what does that look like? And so there needs to be some thought about that, and a lot of discussion at the beginning. And then, of course, there's a question of who's paying for it and who owns it. And those need to be established and codified, and things need to be very clear in writing. Conservation easements are a tool that we, of course, use around the country, and particularly here in the Northeast, to bring down the cost of farms. A conservation easement in the Northeast generally reduces the cost of a farm by 40 to 60%. And so it can be a very good tool to help with the group farming, to be able to make it more affordable to everyone involved. But easements have requirements and restrictions. And so if you're looking at a farm that's already conserved, you have to see what it'll allow you to, does it have enough flexibility to allow you to do what you might want to do as a group there? Or if you're buying a property, the idea that you're going to sell development rights to a land trust or a public entity, would they allow you to structure it in a way to do what you want to do for group farming? You know, as an example, I worked with a farm recently that about a decade ago conserved their farm. They conserved it with the primary farmhouse, a cabin on there that was 3-season for farm workers, but under the easement would be allowed to be made into a year-round house, and another house site that could be developed. But none of those 3 house sites could be subdivided. They were all attached to the easement. So everything was subject to the easement. And when this family wanted to bring in a new farmer to co-own the land with them, the original thought was that they would buy the cabin and make that a 4-season house, and that they would build up equity in that house. And so they would each own their own houses, have ground leases with a new LLC that we were going to create to hold the land. And they would own that land together and start transferring equity to that younger generation, so they would have shared ownership in the land. Well, that turned out to not work at all with the easement, the way it was structured and who held it. And a lot of conversations that ultimately we had to go with different tact, which was that they were going to put all of the whole land into an LLC that then had leases for each home that provided rights and responsibilities and a way of accounting through the capital accounts in the LLC for the differences in equity that they would have in the entire property because of the difference in equity that they had in their houses. And so we had to be creative, and we had to look at what was really going to be possible within that easement. Next slide. Financing, the financial part of this, of course, is really critical. Financing in some of these situations can be very straightforward, especially if it's multiple family member or multiple people. Doesn't have to be family members, multiple people that are all in one business entity, accessing one parcel. Many of the typical approaches to financing are available. If you start to deviate from some of the more established ways of holding land, and particularly around holding infrastructure and housing, that's where it can start to get more difficult. And so you need to think about how you're structuring things, having some conversations with some lenders ahead of time to start thinking about, well, maybe we can structure things in such a way that it will be acceptable to a lender, can be helpful. The people that are involved is important too. You know, for instance, if you're going to go to the USDA's Farm Service Agency for loans, if you have a mix of farmers who've been farming more than 10 years and farmers have been farming less than 10 years, and they're all together in one entity, then it's no longer eligible, as I understand, for a beginner farmer loan, because you don't have solely beginner farmers in the group. If you have non-farmers that are also in the group, they may not be eligible for FSA financing. And so looking at what the what the eligibility requirements of some of the lenders you might go to is going to be something that you might consider, though of course you may need to just seek out alternative financing if you want to keep the group as you are. The trickiest part can usually be financing homes on the property, particularly if the homes are non-subdividable or there's other restrictions. So there's some groups have restrictions on who the houses can be sold to. There may have to be approval of buyers by the whole group. They may specify that only farmers can be buyers. There might be a limited equity clause that reduces the amount of collateral value that might be there. And so the amount of collateral that's available to a lender, and then their ability to foreclose in that unfortunate situation where, you know, someone isn't paying their loans, is critical to the lenders being able to decide whether they can go forward. If they think that they can go forward in that situation and foreclose and then be able to resell the house and be able to recoup their loan, then it can be easier. If the structure makes it more complicated, then it's going to be harder to find financing. I will say, though, that I've seen people get creative with this. We're going to hear a couple of examples, and you know, financing is definitely possible, but you definitely have to be thinking about this in the formation of the organization from the beginning. There are some lenders out there that you know, can be available, that can be helpful in this case. As I said, if it's the right group and the right structures and so forth for the right purposes, FSA is still comes to the table in some of these. The Cooperative Fund of the Northeast funds specifically finances cooperatives. They're structured as such. Some credit unions can be more flexible, or community loan funds can have some more flexibility. And we're going to hear about a little bit about that. People always ask us about grants, but there's not really grants that I know of about towards purchasing land, though there are people who are definitely trying to work towards this, you know, put an effort towards creating that. American Farmland Trust does have some small grants to provide for people to get money for technical support towards legal work and otherwise towards that you can apply for, that might help you in figuring out how to get these things structured and how to approach this. Otherwise, you know, again, I don't know any grants for actually, you know, purchasing the land. If you're familiar with agrarian commons or agrarian trust, they rely heavily on philanthropy, in other words, donations, crowdfunding to buy the land, and there are other examples out there, nonprofits that use philanthropy to be able to access their land. When you're putting together your structure, you also want to think about eligibility for USDA and state agricultural program funding, and making sure that there's nothing that you put into place that might make it too difficult for people to say get an NRCS tunnel or irrigation cost share or fencing cost share. And thinking about, well, what's going to be the approval process again on infrastructure. So if somebody's applying for an NRCS grant, has a lease with an entity who can sign off to say that that's going to be allowed. Property tax assessments is something to look out for, particularly if there's a limited equity clauses in the way things are structured. So if someone's house is not going to be, they're not ever going to be able to resell it at the full market value, the town or county or municipality may still assess it at its full market value. And there may be cases where where the municipality may have some flexibility and recognize those sort of things, but I think some people could get blindsided by the fact that they may find a full market assessment, tax assessment in their tax bill. Land-based adequacy. This is something that I think really needs a lot of attention in this, and often gets overlooked or maybe kind of glossed over. It's important, I think, for the businesses, particularly if they're not already firmly established, where they know they have a certain size that works for them, and that they know exactly how much land that they really need, that they may not know exactly how much land of this group owned land or group access land that they actually need. And that can become a problem when people get onto a piece of land, and including if it's a new piece of land to everyone, and you don't know where all the wet spots are, or where the poor producing parts of the parcel are and such. And you may find that even someone who knows I need 10 acres to do what I'm doing, maybe this parcel, they need 12 because it's not as productive. And you need to be thinking about these sort of things, not just in the immediate future, but for the long-term future, because as much as I know that a lot of business think, oh, I really only want to be 10 acres. That's the size I always want to be. Even if you don't have 10% inflation, the economy pushes in the direction of the business growing. And that doesn't always mean growing in size. Sometimes it can be growing in efficiency and productivity, raising prices, doing more stuff under high tunnels and such. But often it does mean needing to take on more land. And so is this land base going to be adequate for all the people that want to use it, not just now, but in the future? Now, there may be other ways to address it in the future. Maybe the group buys more land down the road once they're firmly established. Maybe individuals buy land offsite. Sometimes people retire getting out of farming, and maybe instead of bringing on another party, that party that still remains takes on more land on there. But this really, for this to work and be sustainable, really has to be considered. In some cases, it can also be beneficial if people think through things. So for instance, you have a livestock farmer and a vegetable farmer, and the vegetable farmer wants more land to do bigger rotations and do more fallow. They may rotate hayland or pasture with that vegetable farm, and it can be a real positive experience. Next slide. So, a real fundamental question to this is, does the group land tenure structure, does the particular parcel that you're buying and the way you're buying it and financing it, does it actually provide an initial affordability to everyone? Because you can't take that for granted. Just buying a piece together doesn't automatically make it more affordable. And so people should be looking at the numbers and comparing it to what their other options are, because this is a lot of work, and it's a lot of, and it can be great for everyone, but it can also add a lot of stress, time together. And so to go through that, it's really got to be worth it. It's really got to be making it more affordable to people. Sometimes it can be a matter of just you're buying a larger parcel than any of the individuals would want, and larger parcels tend to have a lower value per acre than smaller parcels. So it definitely could be an advantage that way. Pooling some of the capital for down payment and closing costs can be a benefit here. Shared infrastructure, one big barn that maybe you wouldn't need all on your own, but you can share the maintenance and the cost of it together. So there's definitely could be benefits, don't get me wrong, but I think it's important to not take that for granted. I'll just touch again on the conservation funding. Conservation funding can be really important to this, but you have to think about eligibility and is this funding really going to allow the group to do what they want to do on the property? Or should you consider configuring the easement in such a way, for instance, where housing is maybe not involved in the easement and can be held separately, so that that's completely out of their control and maybe even be financed differently? And then here's a fundamental question that I see people grappling with, and sometimes coming at it from very different perspectives. Is are people building wealth and equity in land? When we hear people talking about these group farm tenure processes, we see both, there are people who are talking about this as a way of generating family wealth and legacy, and particularly people who've not had access to the land before. This might be an opportunity that they otherwise couldn't take advantage of to start building up a family legacy of wealth and land. On the other hand, we hear people talking about decommodifying land and using this group land access as a way of basically taking that value out and taking that equity out. And sometimes people don't seem to see those contradictions there. And I think it's important for people to think about, again, what are their goals here? What are they really trying to do? A lot of these models tend to trying to find a sweet spot in between. These last three bullets on these slides kind of all link together, because some people do want to build up that family legacy and wealth to a point, but not to a point where it makes it unaffordable to the next generation, where it becomes part of the speculative market. We often see that when farmers go to retire, they need to cash in on their equity of land in order to be able to afford to retire. If that's not going to be available, then what are the alternative means for those people to be able to retire if they're not going to be able to take out equity in land? And we've seen where people sometimes are not thinking about that early on. They've got a nice affordable way get on land, they're excited and they have this business and they carry on, but they're not thinking about other ways that they're going to be able to fund their retirement. And often it's because they're thinking they're going to farm forever and they will farm until they die, and that there's not going to be any, they're not going to get tired and creaky when you get, a little bit older or have a serious health effect like a stroke. And so it's important for people to be thinking about retirement. And if the land wealth is not going to be a part of that, what are you going to replace it with so that people can live quality lives when they get to retirement? Next slide. One other thing I wanted to say too is, if people end up leaving the property and they have limited equity, they may find that it's difficult to be able to afford another property because they're not able to take as much equity to the next place that may not be as secured. I want to just touch on this real quick in the interest of time. So, Kathy touched on this a bunch. There's 3 things I really want to say here related to the considerations of interpersonal. These things often take time, and they often take time to meet with people and discuss things and go through a process. And that can get exhausting for people, particularly when you've got a farm, when maybe you have young children, which you didn't have when you started this, and you had all the time to talk about this sort of stuff. And so trying to think about whether or not that's really going to be sustainable for yourself and everyone else for the long term, and trying to keep that processes structured in a way that keeps that sort of thing in mind, to keep it to a minimal. That you're going to have some conflict coming along the way. So having a good conflict resolution process is really, really critical, whether it's about stewardship or some of these other issues. Thinking about how shared responsibilities are really delegated amongst the group. Are they really shared, in terms of, say, managing, driveways and plowing and property taxes and insurance or forest management, or any of these things that are across the whole group, dealing with lawyers? Or are there going to be certain people that are going to take on more responsibility? And I've seen where people end up taking on some of that more responsibility and they start getting resentful because it's supposed to be a group effort. Well, maybe it makes more sense to actually compensate them for their time. Or you think about better ways of distributing the work. But either one should be considered. So maybe a matter of saying, some people are just better at this than others, have the time or the capacity or willingness to do it. And we should recognize that as a group where we can't all share everything equally in that respect. So we're going to compensate, we're going to pool our money, we're going to compensate them. And then if this is really going to work and be sustainable, you got to keep it social. You have to keep it fun. You have to keep the group together in something besides the business aspects of it, or else you're going to lose touch with each other. Next slide. So real quickly on the service providers, Land for Good, we can work with people on these group farmland access approaches individually, particularly here in New England. But if you're outside the region, be in touch. We'll see if we can help you or send you to some other resources. Equity Trust in Massachusetts is an organization that's been around a long time that we've worked with. That's does a lot of work around these models, particularly around ground leasing models. The Cooperative Fund of New England and the Northeast, in addition to providing financing, also provides technical support. I mentioned Agrarian Trust and Agrarian Commons, which is trying to buy land that'll be accessed by multiple farmers throughout the country. I encourage you to look at their website if you're not familiar with them. Their model is still evolving, but they're definitely dedicated to providing opportunities that will work for people around the country. I'm not particularly familiar with any specific community land trust organizations, but there are a number out there if you just do a web search. We're going to have a farmer panel coming up in a matter of a couple of minutes here, and reaching out to other people that have already put together these types, and there are a number of these that are out there throughout the country that have already been working on this sort of thing. I think tapping into their experience and knowledge with this is really important. And as I said earlier, having lawyers and accountants that you can work with is really critical to putting together something that is going to be lasting and sustainable and really protects the interests of everyone, including thinking about how do we not create a tax headache for ourselves. Next slide. So I'm going to leave this up here for a minute as we start to encourage people to come for start asking any questions of Kathy and I before we get into the panelists. Vital Communities is an organization in Vermont and New Hampshire that works in a variety of sustainable development issues, and they are holding a webinar series that starts next week. And so if this one session isn't enough for you, you can see there's four different webinars coming up. They'll kind of dig a little bit deeper into the issues that we've talked about today. You can see at the bottom, there's a link there you can go to, and now it's in the chat. So if you'd like to pursue this further, that's another avenue for you there. The number of organizations you can see involved, including Vermont Law School. There's a few people there have been doing a bit of work on this. So with that, before we get into the panelists, did want to give a chance for some questions. And feel free to unmute if you want to ask, or you can put it in the chat.
Thank you.
So, sorry.
Go ahead. And then after Annie, why don't we just have folks either put your question in the chat or raise your hand.
Sorry, I didn't know if we were putting in the chat or not. So I currently have about 25 acres of land or so that's under a conservation easement, and also is technically, I think it's owned under a nonprofit technically. So I was trying to figure out, because there's another farm that's about 250 acres that's right next door to where my farm is, that I was looking to try and talk to the owners about possibly leasing land off of them, or using that land to sort of expand my farm. Because right now, because of the conservation easement, I don't have any I can't build any infrastructure there, or any. I can build I can put a well in, but I can't really put any outbuildings or anything. So I was trying to figure out if there's a good way to kind of be able to have it so that sort of larger lot of land would be able to be. I would have to talk to the owner of the nonprofit, but I think, or like the guy who organized the nonprofit first. But I think I was trying to figure out if there was a good way to kind of put that land under a nonprofit, and be able to have that land sort of merge into the nonprofit.
Well, I guess the first question will be whether that landowner is willing, and if you could strike up a conversation with that landowner. That's the first part of that, and seeing what they're interested in, what their long-term desires and plans for that land is, and if there's some initial interest, then it might be time to get the person from the nonprofit to come in and sit on the meeting. And I could see it going several different ways that we wouldn't have time to get into here. But it could be that the nonprofit has an interest in buying that as well, and has capacity, or may otherwise be able to help you. So I think without knowing what the property owner's interest is, and then what also the nonprofit's interest is, would be kind of hard. But I definitely say it'd be possible. It's certainly worth starting the conversation on. Who is?
Oh, sorry. I don't mean to interrupt for anybody else's questions here.
Thanks. I saw that Fatima had their hand up.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for this presentation and all this information. Me and my husband are considering doing this stuff in Canada, and so she wants to talk to. Okay, you're in the conversation. So we are curious if the information presented also applies to Canada.
I would say generically yes. I think when you start getting into real estate law, it's like I'm referring to limited liability companies, which is a legal entity here in Vermont, which we use, or in Vermont, in the United States. Not familiar how those are and what the legal structures. 501c3 is a U.S. Code, IRS code for nonprofits, and so I'm not familiar exactly what that is in Canada, or each individual Canadian province. Since even in the U.S. these things vary some by by state law. Particularly LLCs and cooperatives vary by state law. So there's going to be some I'm sure that there's parallels, but not having done this work in Canada, I can't say specifically. And so you would really want to talk to legal counsel up there and learn both on the national level and on the provincial level what's available. But I'm sure that I know I've seen that there are community land trusts in other places and these other structures, but and I'm sure there's cooperatives in Canada, but they may be legally defined differently than how they're defined in the US. So I think that generally, certainly all these considerations are still going to come up, the interactions between people and how people get in and get out. You still need to think about that. And then you would tap into the lawyers in your province to help you figure out the details of how to make that legally work. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And I see Maggie has their hand up.
Yeah, I just had a little question about, you mentioned there being maybe some entities or nonprofits or whatnot that might be options for helping with the cost of all the legal advice that's required to do something like this. I was wondering if you had any specific like things to look for at nonprofits or whatnot to reach out.
So, a couple that I'm familiar with, and Kathy may add to this, but so for the last couple of years, American Farmland Trust, at least here in the Northeast, has offered some support grants for land access and transfer. They've already gone through their round for or their initial stage for this round for this winter, selecting who they're going to have apply, do a full application. There are in New England, there are these legal food hubs that get lawyers to work for pro bono or low bono cost. We've seen that there's some varying levels of expertise. Some attorneys are better than others that are offering those services. So you really want to screen those attorneys. But those would be two examples. I don't know if Kathy, you have anything else to add?
No.
Okay, hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
What other questions do folks have? You could put it in the chat or raise your hand if you wanted to jump in. Otherwise,
we'll go to the panelists.
Yeah, otherwise we'll go to the panelists.
I think we'll save the remaining questions for the end, because we definitely want to make sure we get to the panelists.
Great.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I just know there is another answer, at least if you're in Maine, there's a technical assistance grant from MAFCA that's also potentially available.
Thank you. So for each of the panelists, and I think we'll start with Maria if you're still interested in that. We have some questions for you that I think we sent them out ahead of time, but here they are again in the chat. We'd love to hear from you just a little bit about who you are and about your farm, and then tell us what is your land tenure arrangement and why did you choose that one? What do you like about it? What are some of the challenges? And then did you receive help from any service providers or groups, and how did that go if so? So those are the questions, and then we'll hear from each of the three panelists and then open it up to participants.
Go ahead, Maria, you can go ahead and start. You need to unmute.
Okay, you guys can hear me now? Okay, hi, my name is Maria Oliveros. I have a 0.5 acre farm in Nuestras Raíces. They have a 30-acre farm, so I just have a tiny little dot of their farm. We have a community farm. There's 10 farmers that have lots right now there. So my farm is floor farm. I have like an array of different vegetables that I grow, from like corn and pumpkins, different squashes, eggplants, tomatoes, you name it, beans, I try to grow it, So, and then this year coming up, we're trying to hopefully to grow some more peppers and stuff like that, since I'm trying to make my own hot sauce now because of the farm. And we're doing a dried herbs line. So hopefully those are other things that I'm doing with the farm as well. So with Nuestras Raíces, I have like an agreement with them. It's basically just you can get up to 1 acre of land. I only chose to do half because I do everything by myself. And I don't get any financial help from anybody. Everything I have done by myself. A lot of it, I want to say I do it by hand. Just because it's not because I can't afford to get the stuff. I want to do it myself by hand. I think that is a better experience, and the food tastes better. When you eat it, it's just my own personal choice to want to do a lot of stuff by hand. I do use a tiller and other things, but usually it's everything like hand tools. Um,
So what is your agreement with Nuestras Raíces? Is it a year-to-year lease, or what is the?
So our lease is for the season, it's like 6 months. So for like the season from May to it finishes in October. And it's okay. We pay a little bit of money for the land. All of the farmers get together and stuff, and we have meetings every month, and so it's fun, and they try to make it fun. You got to deal with different personalities because there are other people with, even though a lot of us are Hispanic, but we have different ways in which we were raised and different cultures and stuff. So it's it's fun. Yeah.
So are there additional things that you like about it or that you find challenging in the?
Yeah, so right now, because of global warming, we've been having a lot of the bugs are horrible, they're just like one day they're not there and the next day they're there and they just ate all your crops. So like I'm having problems with the little silk corn worms, I believe. They look like little yellow ladybugs, but they're horrible. They'll eat everything in like one day. So that's probably like the only thing that I had problems with this year, which is the only year that I did cut up. It's my first year. But that was probably the only thing that I really had a problem with. Everything else was okay. I could deal with it. But the bugs, they're just like getting all over the place. So that's something that for the following year is something that we might, look into to be able to work on better. We're also planning to hopefully do horizontal growing. Not horizontal, but vertical growing, like bringing them up. I've been thinking about doing that just because maybe it'll help with like, the pest and everything, and keeping, a lot of the plants from catching like different, like bacteria or whatever they catch, those, there's like oh my God, I was reading about it the other day. It makes your plants turn black. And I caught that on my, like my tomato plants caught it a little bit.
Maria, how about as far as your arrangement with Nuestras? Is there things that you like about the arrangement? Why did you choose to farm there as opposed to trying to find land somewhere else?
So I decided to go with Nuestras Raíces. One, because it's in the community that I am in. And they're all Hispanic. I think it's just an easier way. It's more financially accessible. I can afford it. Opposed to somewhere else where I might need, like you said earlier, it's like a ton of paperwork, and you have to be able to provide all of these things. And with them, it's a little bit easier, and it's more lenient. You're able to do more. You know, so it's a better, I think, agreement.
And how much are you pay? How much are you charged?
So I do half an acre. It's like $60 per quarter acre.
For the year or
So
for,
so I pay like $120 a month.
and did you get access to water or any kind of
Yeah,
infrastructure?
so we have a well. We're not allowed to keep anything up, but we're allowed to set something up like a structure that you can take out, so you can do like a little temporary greenhouse in your area. But by the end of the season, you have to be able to tear everything up and take it with you.
In terms of the relationship with the other farmers who are renting there, you mentioned earlier that sometimes there may be cultural differences or differences in communicating. Can you think of some examples of where it's taken like a lot of time or it's been challenging to work out some of the issues or topics with the other farmers?
Well, with me, one of my biggest hurdle was that I am obviously a woman. I'm a girl. They're all men, and I'm 5'4", and I'm like 130 pounds. So easily I'm going out there, even though they're Hispanic, they're looking at me and they're like, this little person cannot do this, you know, and she got too much land. She doesn't know what she's doing, you know, so I had to prove myself, you know, to them, to show them that, hey, you know, I'm little, but I'm an ant, you know, and I can do this, you know. So we're gonna, you know, so I, you know, over the season, I gained their, what I want to say, like their respect, you know. But it was, at first, it was hard because, you know, in their culture, they're not used to seeing women out there farming. You know, it's not something that they I guess they have not seen every day, other than like their wives when they come out and help them, you know. So that was something that was a little bit challenging to get them to really, you know, let me in and see that, you know, I am serious about, you know, being here and, you know, farming with them and everything, you know.
So in terms of sharing resources and ideas and so on, there was some resistance because of the gender issue. That's very interesting. And
yeah, like, I don't mean to cut you off. I think in my age difference too, because I'm so much younger than them. A lot of them were older, like they're much older. They're like in their, I want to say like in their 70s. Some of them are in their late 60s. So they're like, and I'm 39. So I'm an old lady, but I'm not I'm not that old. So yeah, so we had a, you know, so it was a little, you know, but just, you know, it wasn't like a bad thing. It was just, you know, being able to show them that, hey, you know, just because I'm a woman and I'm young, you know, doesn't mean that I can't do or pull the same thing that you're doing, you know.
Thank you.
Do you know who actually owns the land?
So I think it's owned by the trustees right now. So it used to be the nuns that used to own it.
The
Then they left
Trustees of Reservations, which is a
Yeah.
conservation nonprofit.
Yes.
So then Nuestras has a lease with them, and then you have a sublease or a license. I don't know what your actual document says, but that's sort of the order of things.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Are there things that you think could be done differently with the way that the use of the land is, or shared resources that could make it better for you or other tenants there?
I think that I mean, everything is it runs okay. I mean, everybody sometimes has something negative to say, but I have nothing like negative. I think that everything is it runs okay. It's up to the individual, I think, to what they would think, you know, could be better. To me, I find everything to be okay. You know, the way that they run things. I want to say maybe the only thing is the way that they share their like the equipment. Maybe there could be like a way where it could be more easily accessible, or, you know, readily available to us. Because some of the stuff is like broken, or they need to be repaired, or so that's probably the only thing.
So is the equipment owned by Nuestras?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
But it's supposed to be like community equipment that we can use within the farm for me and all the other farmers.
Sometimes that's one of the trickiest things to work out in a group arrangement, regardless of what the tenure is the stuff around equipment and broken equipment and maintaining equipment. So
Yeah.
Rachel,
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. It's really nice to hear from you, and hopefully the participants will have some questions for you at the end. I'd like to give some of our other folks a chance to speak. I'm not sure which one of you would like to go next. Looks like Ben, you undid your camera. Would you like to speak next?
Sure, happy to go next.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
So same set of questions.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for having me today. My name is Ben Whalen. I'm one of the owners of Bumblebird Organic Farm. We farm 7 acres on our property is 89 acres. We cultivate 7 acres in Windham, Maine. We're about 25 minutes from downtown Portland. We've been on our property this is our 6th year, but we've been farming for 8 years as a group. So we started our farm, our first season was in 2015, and the farm is owned by 2 couples, 4 friends. So it's my wife, Melissa, and then our friends, Jeff and Abby Fisher. And we started our farm. It's hard to talk about our land tenure without talking about our farm kind of composition as well, just because we created our farm first. And when we were talking about starting a farm, when Melissa and I were talking about starting a farm, kind of happening in tandem as our friends Jeff and I were talking about starting a farm. Jeff and I had worked together for 3 years on a farm in Colorado. So we worked well together. We had learned how to farm kind of the same way together. And if we were gonna start a farm with anybody, it would be with Jeff and Abby, just because we knew we wanted kind of the same vision for our farm. So we decided to just start exploring, starting a business together, what that would look like. We spent about a year workshopping, creating a LLC operating agreement, what our agreement would look like going into business together. And we started our farm first year in 2015 on leased land in Buxton. And pretty quickly we realized we needed more space than we had. So we were looking for land, and this opportunity came up through Maine Farmland Trust to purchase the property that we're on now. They bought this property from the previous owners who'd been on it for a few generations. So they purchased from them, and then they put the agricultural easement on the property. And then we purchased from Maine Farmland Trust at a reduced price. So for Maine Farmland Trust, the original cost of this property was over $600,000, and with the agricultural easement, and then there's an added layer to the agricultural easement called an OPAV, which stands for option of purchase at agricultural value, which means my understanding is if we wanted to sell our property, Maine Farmland Trust needs to either approve the buyer or they could purchase from us at the agricultural value of the land. And that was another level of an easement that helped further reduce the price for us. So it brought the price from over 600,000 to less than 300,000, which for 4 young people with a year of farming business experience, we don't have a lot of resources, and it was a huge, I can't imagine us figuring out how to be on this property without the help from Maine Farmland Trust. And so during that process too, we worked with our lender, CEI, Coastal Enterprises Incorporated, out of Brunswick, and they are a mission-driven lender. So they helped connect us with the Legal Food Hub and also the SBDC, which is a small business development center in Portland. During our process of applying to Maine Farmland Trust to purchase this property, we worked with the Legal Food Hub to create a separate LLC. So we have our farm business LLC where all 4 of us are equal owners, equal 25% owners. And we created a separate land LLC to purchase the property. and is kind of like our real estate land pass-through entity for managing the property. And so we, through the legal food hub, we were connected with a local lawyer who helped navigate some of the things that Mike talked about, just the challenging, what happens with all these terrible situations, what happens to the business and the land. And from the beginning, we structured the land purchase and our business purchase with the idea of maintaining the integrity of the entity itself, the farm itself, at the expense of the individual. And kind of what I mean by that is, it's for me to computer's not plugged in, my battery might die. For me to leave this property, we have a whole wind down process that a sequence to go through. But basically, if any one owner wants to leave the property or leave the business and leave the partnership, it's really the purpose of what we're doing tries to keep the integrity of the remaining structure intact. So if I want to leave, the first step is the remaining owners can collectively buy me out. The next step is one of the owners, if they want to, can buy me out. The next step is the owners can then remaining owners can go find somebody to try to buy my share. And then if that doesn't work, then I can go try to find somebody to buy my share. And then if that doesn't work, there's no real other next step. So if none of that works out, if I can't find somebody to buy my share of the business, then I just can't get out of the business. But the idea behind that was to make sure that if anything happened to change of heart, an event, a disaster, anything, if there were people who wanted to continue to farm this land, the intention is to make sure that is like the highest priority, that if folks want to farm this land, they can continue to farm the land. And so, that's kind of, it's an interesting proposition. When we were just getting started, it's like that was the value, and that continues to be the value. We want this land to be farmed in perpetuity. But now, as our families are growing, our situations are changing, it's just the reality of what that means from an equity standpoint as an owner of this business is becoming pretty clear. There's some other peculiar aspects of our property where there's a house on the property, there's the farm and farm structures, and then there's a separate barn carriage house that Melissa and I renovated into our home. So the ownership of our ownership interest in the land LLC is based on the amount of equity that we put into the property, and that's adjusted annually. And so what that looks like is Jeff and Abby, when we bought the farm, they were going to move into the house. So we viewed it as them buying the house. And so they brought in a larger down payment that was relative to the value of the house versus the rest of the things on the property. The farm was buying the farm and the farm structures, and then Melissa and I were buying the carriage house. And so we created values on all of those things based on the initial appraisal, and those values are tied to a percentage of the mortgage. And so every year we pay rent to the LLC, and that rent then goes to cover the mortgage, goes to cover insurance, and goes to cover taxes. And so part of that story, as well as Melissa and I, after the first year we purchased the farm, Melissa and I renovated the carriage house, which was just 4 walls and a concrete slab, into a 2-bedroom house. And to do that, we weren't able to get outside financing. We had to go, and we got a couple family members to give us loans to be able to afford to put $100,000 into renovating this house. And so what happened when we did that was us taking a chunk, like $100,000 chunk of outside money, bringing it into the business as equity, as capital. And so our percentage ownership of the land just jumped up that year because we had just put $100,000 of our own equity into the property. Where for Jeff and Abby, they put a down payment for the purchase of the property, but most of their equity into the business or into the land LLC is coming from the principal payments on those mortgage payments every year, every month, every year. But we're still in relatively early days of our mortgage. And so those, we're still mostly paying interest. The principal's not huge right now. So that's sort of like a peculiar way that our equity in the property works. And additionally, if I ever wanted to leave this arrangement, the value of that equity is like there's no increase or additional value that gets added to that equity, meaning our house, which we took out this money, we invested in this structure to build it, we did 95% of the work ourselves. The value of this house is more than the money that we put into it. But when I leave this, if I were to ever leave this arrangement, I would only get that dollar value of equity that I put in that capital. And we track that on an annual basis through capital accounts. And if, you know, I think last year, Jeff and Abby replaced a bunch of windows in their house. And so that was like $5,000 that went into their equity, their capital account. So there's a way that we track some of these things on a yearly basis. But kind of the big picture of what we were trying to do, we're 4 friends. Our vision was to farm. We wanted to own land. And it was always pooling, sharing our resources collectively. When we started our farm business, we were able to start our farm business we each brought $5,000 of our own money to the business. And then we were able to get $5,000 loans from 3 other family members, and they were from 3 different families. And so with that, I think that's $35,000 is what we used to start our farm. We bought a tractor, bought a greenhouse. And so there's always been this ethos of sort of shared resources, or using those resources to help achieve a larger goal. And it's fun. It's interesting kind of what Kathy was saying. It's like the model of shared farming is like super, super old. Like shared land is really, really old. And it's funny that we view this as sort of a novel thing now, just because farming has become so individual. But there's such a huge benefit for our farm business to be having this sort of, it's shared ownership, but it's shared responsibility. We're able to, I don't think we would have been able to grow our business as quickly as we have without the resources of the 4 owners kind of being put towards the business. It's allowed us to specialize in certain aspects of the business, and also, just kind of grow a little quicker, I think, more sustainably. So kind of what's worked in this model for us is the shared resource piece. We wouldn't have been able to do it if we didn't do it all together when we started out. Also, we separating the farm from the land, I think has been a really important step in this, and creating a separate land LLC. Part of that too is, as we're thinking about our farm business now, we are thinking about changing the ownership structure of our farm business to try to bring in some of our employees who've been with us, like some level of ownership in that. And it'll be nice to be able to workshop the farm business separate from changing any major changes to the land LLC, which is where we live. It's the ownership on that. We're not anticipating anybody else living on the property. So it's nice to have some flexibility there. And yeah, the biggest challenge is just the personal, as we're kind of getting to the stage in life where equity and our families are growing, and it'd be nice to leverage some of the equity that we have in the business. It's really hard to do that. All the capital and equity that we put into this business is kind of locked in this and inaccessible, which is a challenge.
Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate hearing from you. A lot of interesting questions in the chat, so we'll make some time to get to those at the end. I also do want to make time to hear from Jesse. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your farm, your tenure model, and then in about 15 minutes, we'll try to leave space for people's questions.
Great. Thanks for having me. My name is Jesse Cahan, and my wife and I run Wild Carrot Farm in Brattleboro. So we're a 40-something acre farm. We raise mostly vegetables. We got about 4.5, 5 acres of vegetables in production. We at times have raised a bunch of different kinds of meat, chickens, turkeys, pigs, cows for a while. And we are primarily draft horse powered. So we've got 5 horses that we are managing pasture and hayland for as well. And we sell to a 150 member CSA and a farm store on the farm here. And so our situation is unique in that there are 2 farms on this land. There's another farm, Fairwinds Farm, who have been here for close to 50 years now. And when they were ready to kind of start stepping back from farming, not retire whole in whole at all, but sort of saw that they really wanted to see this land used in the long run, stay in agriculture, but didn't want to be the ones keeping it in agriculture until they were 95 years old. So they reached out to us and to lots of people and started putting feelers out, looking for another farmer or farmers to kind of slide into some of the areas of this farm that they were not using. And so we went through that process about 10 years ago. So currently we have 2 farms, 1 farm store that we share. We have vegetable land that is essentially just ours. They don't have any role on it. We share the barns, we share the horses. We have sort of loose MOUs and sort of agreements around use of that. And we share maintenance costs. And we make hay together. We pasture animals together, and we recently turned the woodland piece of our land into a kind of a communal shared model, so that it will always forever be shared amongst everybody who has a lease on this land. So our land itself is owned by a land trust, a community land trust, Earthbridge Community Land Trust, and there's so we don't own the dirt, but we own everything above ground. So we bought our house and the barns from Fairwinds Farm when we moved here. We sublet back to them for the rest of their lives use of those barns. We carved out a little 2-acre parcel for their house and gardens that they have a long-term lease on. But our farm has or I should say, we individually have a lease on an 89-year lease on all the rest of the land. But we share the land equally between the 2 farms. So there's a line somewhere on a map that says this land's ours, this land's sublet back to you. The town knows where that line is for tax purposes. I have no idea where that line is. It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to Fairwinds Farm. It was a way to sort of break up the costs and the and put that in writing. But in practice, we manage land communally, and any major decisions get made around the dining room table, talking it out. And so we do that together. So there's no development restrictions per se on our land. Our land trust doesn't have any specific restrictions. When this land was donated to the land trust, it was put in the deed that it needed to stay within agriculture. So there is some theoretical sense that somebody needs to farm this land, but it's aside from that, there's no restrictions. This year, we decided to build a house for ourselves, a separate house. We moved out of the old farmhouse, built a new house, and are now leasing the old farmhouse to farm employees. And that was a process simply of going to the land trust and to Fairwinds Farm and kind of getting their consent, which was an incredible blessing. When I hear people talk about going through land trusts with all these development restrictions that have been made 30, 40 years ago, that you then have to sort of fit into the keyhole of that structure that was made without any sense of what the future would hold. I feel really fortunate that we have a group of people who can make these decisions thoughtfully and carefully, but given like the realities of today. So I think that's something to keep in mind as we think about protecting land, or what we perceive today as being protecting land. When we got into this arrangement with the Baileys at Fairwinds, there was a temporary short-term arrangement that we set up first. So I think it was 1 to 3 years. I can't remember exactly the arrangement, but we rented the house from them. So we were living there. We had a rent to own agreement. So it was all spelled out what the house was going to cost if we decided to buy it, how much rent was going to be each month, and how much of that would be applied to a principal payment if we decided to stay. But it was also agreed upon that we would, after a certain amount of time, we would each be able to back out, and what that would look like. I think that gave us the ability as young, kind of like didn't quite know what we were getting ourselves into people. I think it was really helpful to be able to get into this situation with an exit strategy that didn't feel like too scary. And I think on their end, they were basically turning over their farm to another couple that they didn't know very well, and that was also very risky. So it was a good way to have a backstop. And it probably took us 3 years to sort of work out all the details in the end and get a final agreement put together. So there's sort of two distinct aspects of our land arrangement that are useful for this discussion. There's the multi-generational land sharing cooperation aspect. So we moved onto this land that had been farmed by a couple for 40 years when we got here. And sort of we now share a bunch of things with them. We share, barns, horses, pasturing, some land, but we also have distinct separate businesses with sovereignty from each other. And then the fact that our land is owned by a land trust and that we will never own the soil, the land itself. But we get to treat it that way. I mean, we think of it as our land. We treat it as if we're going to be here forever, because hopefully we are. We have security in that sense, but we won't ever be able to cash out and retire in the way that Mike was talking about. And I think that it's for us, it's been a really nice balance in that we are able to really like sink roots here and make decisions with a 20, 30, 40 year scope, and just be committed to this space in the same way that we would if we owned it. But the financial but it's not our land, and there's a group of people who in the land trust who own this with us, and we have to kind of hold each other accountable for how we go about using the land. And it's a pretty hands-off approach, but it's I think it's really nice to have a group of people that you get to sort of do this with collaboratively, and it gives a little bit of accountability to us in terms of thinking about how we use this space, and what we do with it. So we chose this arrangement. We were farming on short-term leases on a variety of places, a couple of different places, before we moved here, and we were looking for something that gave us some long-term security that we hadn't found yet. And we had been approached by a handful of landowners who were interested in, a young up and coming farmer sort of using their back 40 or whatever it was. This made a lot more sense for us for a variety of reasons. one of which was that it gave us true long-term security, which was hard to find with some of these other situations. And even though it wasn't as cheap as, you know, getting a very, very cheap lease on a 5-acre piece that we can just grow on. We have a house that we live in here. We have infrastructure, and we had mentors that we inherited when we moved here, who knew the land, knew the details of all sorts of things. They had tools that were here and we could use. There were a lot of really serious upsides. We had a business plan that didn't provide for a lot of income. We both worked off the farm for a number of years, many years. We had pretty limited capital resources to bring to starting the farm and capitalizing a new farm. And so there was really no way we were ever going to buy land or buy a house on the open market, or even probably through the Vermont Land Trust or one of the, you know, agricultural value situations. We just kind of didn't have the capital at the time. And this allowed us to purchase an old, pretty rundown house. There's an 80% equity clause on the house that we lived in. So it's we bought it for 80% of its appraised value, which doesn't include the land underneath it. So it was pretty affordable. I think we paid $110,000 for our house when we bought it, and that, I think that included 118 with all the barns. And when we sell that house, it will be sold for 80% of its appraised value as well. And then we took a lease on the rest of the land, which I think if you combine the house and the land is somewhere between half and 2/3 of what it would have cost us to buy the property if it was for sale. And obviously we don't build equity in nearly the same way that we would if we owned it, and we'll never be able to sell it and retire in that same way. But it allowed us to spend our life farming, and without having, you know, $400,000 to start out with. And that meant that we could farm the way we wanted to on a smaller scale with a little bit less pressure and without taking out a ton of debt. We financed the house directly with Fairwinds Farm. So they wrote us a mortgage. So we never gave them, we give them a deposit up front, but we send them a check every month, or we hand them a check every month. And we will it's a 30-year mortgage. And that worked out for both of us. They weren't looking to kind of cash out and move to North Carolina. Or, you know, they just sort of were looking for some regular income. And we were looking for a bank. And we can get into that. But one of the major challenges of this sort of arrangement is that the banks are really wary of writing a mortgage for a house that you don't own the land underneath. And so it was a workaround, and we feel really privileged to have been able to make that work. So some of the benefits, the mentorship, I think, piece of being able to have farmers who knew what this land was like and what all the idiosyncrasies of it was invaluable and remains that way today. We took minimal debt and started farming the way we wanted to, and like I said before, I think owning land together with other people, even though this is really, we treat this like our land, we also own land collectively on 5 or 6 other parcels, and there's a collective security, and there's a camaraderie that comes with that that's been really, really helpful in terms of us thinking about how we go about this. Some of the downsides, we share nearly everything with our neighbors. Most days I love that. It always leads to an overabundance of comic relief and sort of often banging your head against the wall because you're watching your neighbor do the ridiculous things that they do. in our case, I think it's worked out beautifully, but there are real challenges that in another context or many other contexts would present themselves. Takes a lot of time. We spent, the first few years, we spent many hours in meetings, having supper together, just sort of talking through all the things and feeling out what felt okay about, which tools can I borrow, which tools should I not ask about borrowing, where how much junk can you leave around, how much how many people do you want on the farm, all these aspects that just sort of take, never mind the legal and budgetary considerations that go into running a farm with other people. So we don't do that much anymore. We sort of have felt those things out, and it's pretty easy, but it's definitely something that I think, in terms of thinking about the budget, time and money, there's a lot of time to be spent if you're working with other people this way.
Jesse, sorry to cut you off. I want to make sure to leave time for folks' questions, and there's already a few of them in the chat.
Great. I'm happy to call it there and
thank you.
Take questions.
Thank you so much. So one person asked a general question for all of the groups. So if any of you want to speak to this, feel free to jump in, but this person wants to know how the different farmer groups manage the group decision-making process. And so how did you decide how to decide?
Anyone of the three of you, go ahead.
Jump in. We have a formalized it's a majority vote for everything, and even for our land LLC. I think there are some decisions that have to be unanimous, and I think that involves bringing big decisions, like bringing in somebody new to the business and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's majority, and I would say 9 times out of 10. We just build consensus. There has rarely been, I don't think we've ever actually had to put something to a vote before. If one person felt very strongly about something, I don't think the three of us would bully that person into going forward with something. It's there's a structure, but it's really built around consensus building.
Anyone else?
Jesse, can you just maybe speak a little bit, just the Earthbridge also has a board, right? And you just speak a little bit about.
Yeah, so land use decisions for us, we have basically full freedom until you do something major, like build a big building or greatly change the use of the land. And then there's a process where we would bring it to a committee, like a stewardship committee, and kind of just look for consent, and then theoretically they would give their consent and it would be all set, and if it was a bigger thing, they could kick that up to the board of directors. But the board and all the committees at Earthbridge are made up of lessees just like us. So it's a peer group that's making all those decisions.
Maria, how do they make decisions for the group at Nuestras Raíces? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, in Nuestras Raíces, we have group meetings where we talk about any problems that we would have or anything that arises. And then basically administration from Nuestras Raíces, they take it in, and they are the ones that deal with, making the last, whatever it is that they want to decide to do, they'll decide.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I think this question is more for Mike or Kathy. Do either of you know of any legal templates or resources to form a real estate LLC for farmland access?
There are plenty of LLC templates out there on the internet, none that are specific towards this purpose. But I think I always caution people about LLC templates is the devil's really in the details about figuring out those 5 Ds, how you share management decisions, how you transfer how equity is involved, and there are just too many variables to simply work off of a template. It'd be much better to spend some time either with your consultants like ourselves, with the attorney ultimately, of course, and then in between, reaching out to some of these other farms and organizations to think about how are they making some of those decisions about how the structure would be. But there's really just too many variables to have a template that would be highly useful.
I think there's two aspects to forming an LLC. One is the legal requirements, and the other is the details in the operating agreement. I think, Mike, you're talking about both of those. I think that Farm Commons, which is a nonprofit based in the Midwest, has a lot of resources on forming entities. You might have to sign on as a member to access those, but they are an excellent resource, Farm Commons.
Right, but again, I'd be cautious about then just taking those templates that they offer, and they do have great templates, but to just do that on your own.
Right.
Yeah.
They have a lot of instruction as well, but Mike, your point is important. You really need, in some places, extension, depending on your state and what, whether they have business management folks. There's also small business administration. Sometimes they'll have sufficient expertise to help iron out some of those wrinkles in the LLC. And of course, as Mike is pointing out, an LLC that is formed with the intention of being a group land access entity will have a different kind of operating agreement than a single farm LLC business would.
Thank you. I think this question is for Ben. Someone wanted to know if you have employees, and if so, do they have any equity? And also, is equity only based on money, or do you have any other kinds of equity, like time-based equity?
Yeah, so we do have employees. The farm has employees. We have, in peak season, 10 employees. We have 3 year-round employees. They don't currently have any equity in the farm business, but we're starting. That's kind of, in our minds, the next step. We're going to be probably trying to figure that out in the next year. And no, right now, the way we thought about it, the idea of like time equity and sweat equity was never included in our agreement. And part of me wishes we had figured that out a little bit more, but nobody thought to include that when we were doing our operating agreement. It was just money. And
what do you do if there is ever disagreement about what costs contribute to equity?
There hasn't been a disagreement. We kind of set a threshold of like $5,000 or like structural improvement that would increase the value of your home in a way. The example of like putting new windows on is kind of like a big structural thing, but like repainting the interior of your house doesn't really count. And we're not competitive about it. It's more just trying to capture fairly. So if somebody feels strongly, like we'll include it.
Thank you. This one could be for anyone, including Mike or Kathy, but what suggestions does anyone have about approaching a current landowner to ask about sharing their land, or offering yourself as someone who's looking for land to share?
I mean, that's a question farm seekers often ask. It's not particular to group land access. Certainly people who want to approach a landowner as a group will need to be especially careful about how they present that idea, because it seems even a little bit more, out of the tried and true. I would suggest to whoever asked that question, they check with our Land for Goods website, look at all the resources about acquiring land. We have a guide for landowners, which is good for farm seekers to look at too. And there's general resources there about how to approach folks about renting land.
Thank you.
I have a I mean, I think just having your parameters worked out ahead of time as best you can is always a good idea. As somebody who's gone to a bunch of different people and wanted to use their land for various things, really having a good sense of what you can and cannot accept in some arrangement. And if you wanted to direct message me in the chat, I have some friends who have been through this very, very intensively and successfully, and I could probably link you to them if you'd like.
Great, thanks.
Someone said they were confused about the idea of forming an LLC for the land separate from the land, and then the farm LLC leasing from the land LLC. So it's like one person has two LLCs and you're leasing to yourself. If I didn't quite get that question right, please feel free to jump in and ask it better.
Yeah.
Essentially, that is the model. I'm sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly how our model works. Of we own both entities and we're leasing the land to ourselves, renting with three separate entities on this land. So we have the farm business, we have the Fisher family, we have the Whalen family. We all pay rent to the land LLC, of which the four people, like Melissa, Jeff, Abby, myself, are all the owners of. And there, you know, we've talked about there's some like double taxing that happens slightly, but it's pretty marginal. But that's the only downside, I think, when we're paying rent. We're getting taxed on that income and then potentially taxed on that rent if there's not a cost to offset that.
Separating the real estate from the farm business is a fairly common recommendation by farm advisors. It's not limited just to the group land access model. I don't know if Mike wants to say anything more about that, and maybe we don't have enough time given there might be more questions.
I'll just say real quick, I think one of the particular advantages is just, and Ben was talking about this earlier, is that you might have some people that come into one entity and not another, and people will build up different levels of equity in one and not the other.
Can you say that one more time, Mike?
So some people can have different levels of equity in one of those entities. They might have more equity in the land or more equity in the business. It really allows.
And also different ways of getting in and getting out of the business versus owning the real estate.
Right. And so, for instance, just finished a farm transfer with some people that I worked with for 12 years. And the older couple, the wife, retired 2 years earlier than her husband. And so she sold her shares to the remaining members, but she remained a full member owner of the land. She was still living there. So it gives some more flexibility.
There's some questions in the chat that I'm not really sure if I understand what you're asking, but it seems like this person is asking about the financial process for getting started, for setting up a shared farm, or setting up agreements for equipment structure, etc. If it were me answering, I would direct you to the collection of resources in the toolbox on Land for Good's website. But I'm not sure if I understand your question or if anyone else has anything to add.
I don't, but if it's Annie's question, Annie, I welcome you to email either Mike or myself. It's Kathy at Land for Good or Mike at Land for Good, and we can walk you through some of your other interests.
Yeah, I think there's not a simple, straightforward to the answer, because it really depends on what people are trying to access and what the costs are, what resources they're coming into. Could they be interested in local community groups or philanthropy or crowdfunding? Can you finance it? There's really a variety of ways that question could be answered depending on the particular situation.
Thanks. And thanks very much to our panelists, and thanks also to Mike and Kathy and to everyone for joining us. I put everybody's email, Kathy's and Mike's and mine, and the general mailbox at Land for Good in the chat. So if you would like to reach out to any of us to continue the conversation, we welcome that. And also put in a link to an evaluation form if you would be willing to fill that out. I think it would probably take 3 to 5 minutes. We'd love to hear from you how this went and what other topics you're interested in learning about in future. Thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed this time.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.